Welcome to the webinar training series for the Equals Mathematics curriculum. In this webinar, participants will be provided with information regarding alternative placement options for the Equals Math curriculum. If you have any questions regarding Equals Math, you can contact the curriculum team by email at curriculum@ablenetinc.com. Please feel free to contact us for any additional support or follow-up questions. Remember that implementing the Equals curriculum will take time, and one of the most important steps to being successful is to know what materials you have and how to organize them. Let's get started. The Equals Assessment is a wonderful tool to not only place students in the Equals lessons, but also gain an understanding of your students' math knowledge. If you choose not to use the assessment for placement, there are some things to consider when placing students in the curriculum. This webinar will cover those considerations and provide strategies for appropriately placing students in the curriculum without the use of the assessment. As you begin thinking about placing students within the Equals curriculum, it is important to understand how the lesson objectives are organized. Looking at the Equals lesson objectives from Chapter 1 through Chapter 10, you'll notice the focus is on 6 math content areas. The 5 main content areas, numbers and operations, algebra, geometry, measurement, and data analysis and probability, are identified by the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics. These content areas are reflected within all math standards across the United States. These are the content areas used when writing standards and creating math curriculum. These content areas are interrelated, yet have their own unique traits. Within the Equals curriculum, you'll notice that these content areas are not taught in isolation. They are spread out throughout the lessons and chapters, so that students have the opportunity to strengthen their knowledge and recognize how these content areas work in a system of numbers. The last area is attending and exploring. This was added specifically for those students who have little to no math knowledge, or for those students who are new to math instruction, or even new to the classroom. Students take the experiences learned through attending and exploring, and are introduced to math within their world, and experience these math content areas in meaningful ways. For example, the very first lesson in Equals is student will attend to math instruction with the vocabulary word look. And then, students will touch or tolerate math manipulatives with the vocabulary word touch. Students who begin in the very first lesson will continue in Equals, moving forward like everyone else. The goal within these early lessons is to provide students with a solid foundation to begin building and developing their math knowledge. As they start to understand these skills, they will apply what they are learning and connect that to the other content areas. One of the most important considerations when placing students within the Equals Math curriculum is to recognize the connections present between the content areas embedded within the lesson objectives. When looking at the lesson objective, students will combine 4 quarters to make a dollar. The skills needed to demonstrate an understanding of this skill in a meaningful and functional way begin in Chapter 1 by naming shapes and counting with 1-to-1 correspondence. In Chapter 2, we take what was learned about shapes and learn about how to separate a shape into parts. In Chapter 3, we connect what we know about decomposing a whole shape into parts, to composing and decomposing whole amounts, as well as identifying a dollar and counting to 20. In Chapter 4, we learn about parts and whole by seeing that a whole can be decomposed into 4 equal parts or quarters of a whole. Students' number list now extends to 50. Finally, in Chapter 5, students count to 100, begin to name coins and amount, and apply what they know about the vocabulary word quarter from the previous chapter, and apply it to the skill 4 quarters in a dollar. Learning skills in a connective way supports students when they are asked to demonstrate an understanding of higher level skills. As you begin to place your students within the curriculum, take the time to consider the connective threads present from Chapter 1 to Chapter 10, as this is one of the most important student supports found within the curriculum. When making placement decisions, there are some things to think about as you move forward. District guidelines take precedence. This training provides you with information for placing students based on their math knowledge using the contents pages. However, your district leadership will decide the requirements of placement. If a student has had little or no math instruction, begin with Chapter 1, Lesson 1. These lessons introduce students to important beginning math vocabulary and how to be an active learner. students are introduced to vocabulary such as look, touch, and patterns. Another option is to consult the contents pages of the Equals Overview Manual. Review the lesson objectives from Chapter 1 through Chapter 10. Based on your knowledge of each student's understanding of math concepts, use the contents pages to locate the best starting place. Determine if your student is demonstrating understanding of the skills and the vocabulary in the order they are introduced in the objectives, and determine a starting point based on your recent observations and knowledge of your student. Remember, you want to make sure that this placement is sound, as the lesson order is based on students learning prerequisite concepts in preparation for future lessons. Then, consider starting a lesson or two earlier than your chosen start point to help the students ease into the lessons and experience some success. Or you could begin teaching using the previously stated strategy and confirm that starting point with the assessment at a later time. As you use the contents pages to place your students, keep the following in mind: counting in number order, counting a set with one-to-one correspondence, counting to a given amount with one-to-one correspondence, numeral identification, ordering and comparing amounts using terms more, less, and equal, shape and color identification, knowledge of attributes in sorting, making, duplicating, and extending patterns, creating and analyzing graphs, such as object graphs, pictographs, bar graphs, line plot graphs, and line graphs, and knowledge of the four operations in single and multiple digits in a variety of problem types. Once you have an idea of where your students' skill sets are, consult the contents pages to locate an appropriate placement. I recommend using the contents pages found within the overview manual as opposed to the contents pages within the teacher's guide, so you can get a global view of all of the skills taught within the entire curriculum. As a reminder, the lesson objectives are ordered in a progression. One section of skills is going to build and extend to the next section of skills. This is not restricted to lesson objectives, however, as you will find that vocabulary, strategies, and tools also support deeper understanding in later lessons. I caution you not to place a student too far in the curriculum. If you find yourself placing a student in the later chapters, such as 6 through 10, I recommend analyzing a student's knowledge of vocabulary and math tools during your placement process. You may find it helpful to read through some of the lessons in these later chapters to identify how the skills are being taught. If you find yourself questioning a starting point, read through the lesson in question, paying attention to the teach activity on page 3. This shows the lesson objective in a concrete, semi-concrete, and abstract representational sequence. This will give you a good idea of the expectation of the lesson objective and can help you decide if it is a skill your student has demonstrated in the past. You can also see if your student has a concrete, semi-concrete, or abstract understanding of this particular skill. Be sure to read the vocabulary words taught within the lesson. Another resource you can utilize to check the vocabulary word taught for an entire chapter is the chapter vocabulary document found in the members only content within the resources folder. This document has tabs along the bottom labeled with each chapter. Vocabulary words are organized by lesson order in each tab of the document. In this way, you can see what vocabulary is taught, in which lesson it is taught, and how often. Finally, check the tools and strategies that are used within the lesson. Is your student familiar with those? Here is an example of the contents pages for Chapter 2. Each contents pages is divided up into sections with titles. Those titles indicate the skills that are taught within that section. As an example now, after looking over the contents pages, I feel I could place my student in Chapter 2, Section C. Before I begin teaching any lessons, I will want to first look over the previous 2 sections to make sure my student does indeed have the skills needed to begin in this section. I can also identify any specific skills I feel I would need to teach before starting with this section. For example, this section is about graphing amounts to compare. I would want to make sure my student could count to 10, construct a set to 5, as well as identify sets that are equal before beginning the lessons in Chapter 2, Section C. After you identify the section and prerequisite skills you may want to cover, you can then reference the chapter vocabulary to see if there are specific vocabulary words you feel your student may need to be taught prior to teaching the lessons in the section. Another option is to decide to place a student or group of students at the start of a chapter knowing that this is a new curriculum and the materials and vocabulary are most likely new to them as well. Sometimes starting with familiar content is also helpful when beginning a new curriculum, as it allows students and teachers an opportunity to ease into the lessons while becoming familiar with all of the supports and structure provided. Once you have an idea of where each student will be placed within the curriculum, you can begin to group students with similar math knowledge. Review each student's set of skills and identify those students with the same or similar set of skills. Next, you will want to consider how many groups will be manageable for you during your math time. Equals is meant to be taught in a group setting. It is not recommended to teach equals math in a one-to-one setting. With that said, grouping students with similar math knowledge becomes important in creating 2 to 3 instructional groups to teach during your designated math time. When grouping students, it is not recommended to create instructional groups based on student levels of differentiation. As a reminder, the groups should be based on a student's current math knowledge and understanding. Differentiation has been embedded into the equals lessons, so students, regardless of their ability level, can all work on math content that is appropriate for their current level of math knowledge. Compare each student's math skills to the lesson objectives found within the contents pages of the overview manual. Then choose the chapter and section that best captures your student's math knowledge. Once a chapter and section is identified for each student, you can begin to group students with similar chapter and section placements. An important consideration to think about is that review is okay. Within reason, consider placing a student who may be a little further in their math knowledge with a group that is relatively close in math knowledge. Consider that the curriculum, lesson tools, and vocabulary are new to your students. It may benefit students to begin in an earlier chapter and section so they can review earlier vocabulary and math tools that will only support and deepen their understanding of later skills. When thinking about placing a student in an earlier chapter to make a student group, consider placing students who are within 3 to 4 sections of each other into the same group. This can cover different chapters. Also, consider the amount of lessons in the earlier sections and the lesson objective connections to the later skills. To give an example of how to place students based on their math knowledge, this is an example of my students' placements after I've listed their skills and identified the chapter and section that best suits their math knowledge using the contents pages. Once I have the students' chapter and sections listed, I can then start creating groups with similar chapter placements. Notice my Chapter 3 group. I've placed my student who could be appropriately placed in Chapter 4, Section A, with my Chapter 3, Section D group. I chose to place this student with my Chapter 3 group so this student could be included in a group lesson. The review of skills in Chapter 3 will be helpful in strengthening these foundational skills and will better prepare the student for higher level skills in Chapter 4. As a reminder, the point is not to get through the curriculum as quickly as possible, but to establish the early prerequisite skills needed that makes math functional within the student's world. Moving out of grouping now, a couple of housekeeping items when reviewing the lesson objectives. A common question asked when looking at the lesson objectives is, what does the language join result unknown or separate result unknown mean? These lesson objectives are considered different problem types for the 4 operations that students learn in a specific order. The contents pages reflect this order, and as students work through the lessons and come to these specific lessons, they continue to build on past knowledge with that operation and problem type and apply previously taught strategies or math tools to solve new problems when working with 1-digit amounts all the way to 4-digit amounts. Join problem types relate to addition problems, and separate problem types are subtraction problems. You may see these lesson objectives represented by letters as well. As we conclude this webinar, I would like to thank you for your time today. The Equals curriculum provides consistency and support as students are introduced to new math skills. If you have any questions or would like to request a live training for the Equals math curriculum, please contact a curriculum team representative at curriculum@ablenetinc.com. We look forward to hearing from you.